Someone had been using my name for 8 months. My signature, the one I had written 30,000 times over 63 years, the one Robert once said he could identify from across a room, had been duplicated on a legal document that was quietly dismantling everything we had built. The person who did it was sitting at my son's dinner table, passing the breadbasket, asking if anyone wanted more wine. I did not say anything that evening. I did not need to. I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I made the peach cobbler the same way I had for 31 years. Same cast iron dish Robert bought at a yard sale on Cascade Road. Same recipe his mother wrote on an index card in 1987. The ink faded now to a pale rust color that I could still read if I held it close enough to the kitchen light. Same ratio of brown sugar to butter. Same pinch of nutmeg that nobody ever identified but everybody always noticed. I set it on the passenger seat of my car, covered it with a dish towel printed with little Georgia peaches, and backed out of the driveway on Magnolia Lane at 5:30 on a Sunday evening in October. The drive to Derek and Cassie's house took 18 minutes if I caught the lights on Peachtree Road right. I rarely did. That evening I didn't try. I drove the long way, past the old Cascade Baptist Church where Robert and I were married, past the Kroger where Derek used to ride in the cart and pretend it was a spaceship, past the stretch of oak trees that had somehow survived 40 years of Atlanta development and still stood wide and unhurried along the roadside. I needed those 18 minutes. I needed every one of them. Sunday dinner at Derek and Cassie's had been a standing arrangement for 3 years now. It had started the year after Robert passed. Derek's idea, his way of checking on me without saying he was checking on me. I appreciated that about my son. He had his father's instinct for caring without making a person feel cared for against their will. Cassie's contribution to the arrangement was the house, a 4-bedroom colonial in Buckhead with fresh paint every 2 years, and a kitchen that had never once smelled like anything was actually cooking in it. She ordered from a restaurant on Far Road and arranged the food in her own serving dishes before anyone arrived. I noticed the first time. I never said a word. I pulled into the driveway at 10 minutes to 6 and sat in the car for a moment, dish towel and cobbler warm in my lap. The front door had a new wreath on it, eucalyptus and dried cotton, tasteful and expensive. The kind of wreath that was meant to be looked at rather than touched. Cassie met me at the door in pressed ivory slacks and a silk blouse, the color of a bruise just beginning to fade. She smiled the way people smile in photographs, quick and precise, and aimed just past your eyes. Eleanor. She took the cobbler dish from my hands before I had finished offering it. You really didn't need to. She always said that. She always meant it. Inside, the dining room was set with the kind of care that announces itself. Linen napkins folded into triangles. Candles already lit at 6 in the evening. Derek came out of the kitchen in his weekend clothes, gave me a hug that lasted exactly long enough, and said the food smelled good. We both knew he was talking about my cobbler and not whatever was warming in Cassie's oven. Lily was already at the table, 14 years old, and folded into her chair with a book open in her lap, reading the way she always read completely, as if the rest of the room had agreed to wait. She looked up when I came in, and the expression on her face shifted into something genuine and unguarded. "Hey, Grandma Ellie." "Hey yourself," I said, and squeezed her shoulder as I passed. Cassie's parents arrived 10 minutes after I did. Richard and Pamela Voss, from Marietta, both of them dressed for a dinner 2 levels more formal than this one. Richard shook my hand firmly. Pamela kissed my cheek and asked how my garden was coming along. She asked every time. I answered every time. That was our arrangement. The meal proceeded the way these meals usually did, conversation moving from lane to lane, like traffic, polite and purposeful and never quite arriving anywhere real. Richard discussed a golf trip to Sea Island. Derek talked about a renovation project in Midtown. Pamela asked Lily about school. I answered questions when they were directed at me, and asked them when it seemed appropriate, and listened more than I spoke, which was my preference in rooms like that one. It was during the second course that Cassie set down her wine glass and looked at me with an expression I had seen before, careful and bright, and carrying something underneath it. "You know, Eleanor," she said, her voice light as powder, "I've always admired how content you are, with your little routines, your garden, your cobbler." She smiled at the table, including everyone in her generosity. Some people need more, of course, but not everyone is built for ambition, are they? The table went quiet in that particular way. That means everyone heard, and no one will say so. She tilted her head slightly. finishing the thought like she was doing me a favor. "You've never really understood how the real world works, have you, Eleanor?" I looked at her. I let the words sit where she had placed them. Derek looked down at his plate. Lily looked at me, her eyes steady and dark, and older than 14 had any right to be. The candles held perfectly still. I picked up my napkin, folded it once, and set it beside my plate. I thanked Pamela for a lovely evening. I told Richard it had been good to see him. I hugged Derek, who hugged me back without saying anything, which was its own kind of apology. I kissed the top of Lily's head and felt her lean into it just slightly, just for a second, the way she had since she was small. I got my coat from the front closet, picked up my empty cobbler dish from the kitchen counter where Cassie had left it, and walked out to my car. The drive home was quiet. Atlanta on a Sunday night has a particular stillness to it, a held-breath quality, like the city is gathering itself for the week ahead. I drove slowly, no reason to hurry, the dish towel folded on the passenger seat where the cobbler had been. I let myself into the house on Magnolia Lane, hung my coat on the hook by the door, and walked upstairs to change out of my good clothes. That was when I saw it. The red velvet box on the shelf above my dresser, the one that had sat in the same spot for 5 years, the one I dusted around and never moved, was open. I crossed the room and looked inside. The gold signet ring Robert had worn on his right hand for 40 years, the one with his initials pressed into the face and a line of small numbers engraved on the inner band that I had never thought to question, was gone. I stood there longer than I should have. My hand rested on the edge of the shelf, fingers touching the open lid of the red velvet box, and I kept looking at the place where the ring had been, the small oval impression pressed into the velvet over 40 years of holding the same weight in the same position. The fabric had shaped itself around that ring the way certain things in a life shape themselves around a person. Quietly, completely, without being asked. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and I thought about Robert. I met him in the spring of 1993 at an estate sale on West Paces Ferry Road. I was 33 years old, working as an appraiser for a small firm downtown, moving through a house full of someone else's accumulated life and writing numbers in a notebook. Robert was there as a buyer or so, he said. Mostly he was watching. He had a way of standing in a room that made him look like he belonged to it, unhurried and attentive, the way a good piece of furniture belongs to a room without announcing itself. He asked me about a writing desk in the corner. I told him it was a reproduction, not worth what the family was asking. He bought it anyway. I asked him why. He said sometimes the value of a thing had nothing to do with what it was worth on paper. We had dinner 3 nights later at a place on Peachtree Road that no longer exists. He talked about auctions the way some men talk about theology, with conviction and a kind of reverence that made you want to believe what he believed. He had an idea, he said. An auction house that dealt in estates, in the kind of accumulated history that families sometimes didn't know they were sitting on. Atlanta was growing. Old money was moving. There was a gap in the market, and he intended to stand in it. I told him I thought his idea was sound, but his timeline was optimistic. He asked me if I would help him build it. I told him I would think about it. I thought about it for approximately 4 days. And then I called him and said yes. We opened Hargrove & Associates in a rented office on Peachtree Street in 1994, 2 rooms and a reception area with a window that looked out onto a parking structure. Robert handled the vision and the relationships. He was the kind of man people trusted immediately, something in his bearing that communicated steadiness without effort. He remembered names, remembered details, remembered what a person had mentioned 6 months ago about their mother's silver candlesticks, and followed up when something matching that description came across our desk. I handled everything else. The contracts, the negotiations, the appraisals, the strategy. I learned early that the most valuable skill in an auction house was not enthusiasm, it was patience combined with precision. Knowing when to push and when to wait. Knowing which clients needed to feel they had been heard before they would agree to anything. Robert used to say I could read a room the way other people read a newspaper, quickly, completely, and without missing the parts hidden between the headlines. We grew slowly at first, then steadily, then in a way that surprised even us. By the early 2000s, we had moved to a proper office on Peachtree, staff of 11, a reputation that had spread well past Atlanta into Savannah, Charlotte, and Birmingham. Estate families called us first. That was the measure Robert used, not revenue, not square footage, but whether people called us first. He wore the signet ring every day. Had it made the year we incorporated yellow gold, his initials pressed into a flat face, plain and substantial, The way he was plain and substantial. He said a man who built something should have something on his hand that reminded him of it. I used to tease him that it was old-fashioned. He used to say he was old-fashioned, about the things worth being old-fashioned about. 5 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in November, Robert had a stroke in his office on the 3rd floor of the Hargrove building. He was 68 years old. He had been in good health, as far as any of us knew, the kind of health that makes the end, when it comes, feel like a clerical error. He was lucid for 3 days after, long enough to say the things that needed saying, long enough to press my hand and tell me the company was sound and that I already knew everything I needed to know about running it. Long enough to tell me there was a white envelope in the safe at home, sealed, with my name written on the front in his careful block letters. He told me not to open it until the time was right. I asked him how I would know when that was. He smiled the particular smile he reserved for questions he considered answerable but not by him, and said I would know. He died 4 days later, on a Saturday, with the Atlanta skyline gray and quiet outside the window, and the ring still on his finger. The nurses removed it carefully and placed it in my hand. It was heavier than I expected. Or maybe I had simply forgotten, over the years, how much weight a small thing could carry. I put it in the red velvet box. I put the box on the shelf above my dresser, in the spot where it had been ever since. The white envelope went into the safe in the back of the bedroom closet, fireproof. Combination only I knew. I had looked at it perhaps 100 times in 5 years, picked it up twice. Both times I put it back without opening it. Robert had said I would know when the time was right. 5 years later, sitting on the edge of my bed in the quiet of a Sunday night in October, looking at an empty velvet box on a shelf above my dresser, I was beginning to think the time was getting close. Robert used to say that the most dangerous thing you could do in this business was underestimate a quiet person. He said it about clients, about competitors, about the room in general. He meant it as professional advice. I had spent the past 4 years watching it become something more personal than that. Lily came to me the first time alone on a Saturday morning in late September 4 years ago. She was 10 years old, Derek's daughter from his first marriage, small for her age, and serious in the way that certain children are serious not because they have been made unhappy, but because they arrived in the world paying closer attention than most people around them were comfortable with. She knocked on my front door at 9:30. I opened it and found her standing on the porch with a library book under one arm and a look on her face that suggested she had thought carefully about coming and had decided it was worth the deliberation. I asked her if her father knew she was here. She said he was sleeping in and her stepmother was at a showing on the north side, and she had walked the 4 blocks from their house because she wanted to know if I could teach her how to make the peach cobbler. I told her to come in. We spent that morning in the kitchen the way I used to spend mornings with my own mother, not talking about anything in particular, just moving through the work of it together. I showed her how to test a peach for ripeness by pressing gently near the stem. I showed her how to measure brown sugar by feel rather than by the cup, which she found both interesting and slightly alarming. She asked precise questions and waited for complete answers and did not touch anything until she was certain she understood why she was touching it. By the time the cobbler was in the oven, she had filled half a page in a small notebook she pulled from her jacket pocket measurements, temperatures, the specific words I had used for things that did not have standard names. I asked her if she always carried a notebook. She said she liked to write things down before she forgot them. After that, she came most Saturdays when she could manage it. Cassie noticed, of course. Cassie noticed everything that could be categorized and managed. What she did not seem to notice, or perhaps chose not to, was the nature of what was actually happening on those Saturday mornings. She would drop Lily at my house with the particular efficiency of someone checking a task off a list, and she would collect her with the same efficiency 4 hours later, asking Lily what she had done with a pleasantness that did not extend as far as genuine curiosity. What Lily had done, most Saturdays, was watch. She watched the way I moved through my house, which drawers I opened first, which photographs I straightened more often than others, which chair I sat in when I was tired versus when I was thinking. She noticed that I kept Robert's reading glasses in the kitchen drawer even though he had been gone for years by then. She noticed that the blue bowl on the counter was always kept in the same position and asked me once, quietly, if that was on purpose. I told her Robert had liked to see it from the hallway. She wrote that down too. She was not nosy. There is a difference between a child who asks too many questions and a child who asks the right ones. Lily understood that difference intuitively. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered more than she let on. And she had a quality I recognized from a lifetime in the auction business, the ability to sit in a room full of information and extract only what mattered without disturbing the rest. Cassie saw a quiet girl who spent too much time with an old woman and not enough time doing whatever Cassie believed 10-year-olds ought to be doing. She redirected Lily toward activities she considered more appropriate: a Saturday art class, a weekend coding program, a series of social engagements with children from the right kind of families. Lily attended all of them without complaint and continued coming to my house on the Saturdays that remained. I never encouraged her to keep the visits from Cassie. I never had to. Lily understood, with the particular intelligence of a child who has grown up watching adults carefully, that some things are simply better managed with discretion than with conflict. By the time she turned 12, she had stopped bringing the notebook quite so openly. She still carried it. I could see the outline of it in her jacket pocket on cooler days, but she had learned to write in it later, after she had gone home, transcribing whatever she had observed with the same careful precision she brought to everything. I thought about that sometimes, about what Lily was recording in those pages, about what a girl that age, that attentive, that patient, might have noticed that the adults around her had not. I thought about it again now, sitting on the edge of my bed in the quiet dark of a Sunday night, the empty velvet box still open on the shelf across the room. Lily had been in that house tonight. She had been at the table. She had been watching the way she always watched, the way she had been watching for 4 years. I did not know yet what she had seen, but I knew my granddaughter, and I knew that if there was something worth seeing, she had seen it. She was 14 years old, and she already understood that silence could be a kind of watching. I have never been a person who panics. Robert used to say it was one of my better qualities, and occasionally one of my more frustrating ones. When something went wrong, a deal that fell through, a client who changed their mind at the last minute, a shipment of estate pieces that arrived damaged, I had a tendency to go very still and very quiet before I did anything at all. He said watching me process a problem was like watching a clock reset itself, all the moving parts going still for just a moment before they started up again in the right direction. I sat on the edge of my bed and I processed. The velvet box was open. The ring was gone. Those were the facts I had. Everything else was a question, and questions were only useful when you asked them in the right order. The first question was a simple one: who had been in this room? I thought back through the evening carefully, the way I used to think back through an auction item by item, moment by moment, not rushing toward a conclusion before the evidence was ready to support one. Derek had not come upstairs. Lily had stayed in the living room after dinner. I was certain of that. Richard and Pamela Voss had not been past the front hallway. I had checked my coat in the front closet myself. That left Cassie. I remembered it now, clearly, the way details sometimes clarify themselves once you give them the proper frame. We had been standing in the front entryway, coat still on, and Cassie had "The one in my bedroom," she said, on the chair by the window. She had offered to get it for me before dinner. I had said yes. I had not thought twice about it. She had been upstairs for approximately 10 minutes. I had been in the kitchen helping set out the serving dishes, making conversation with Pamela, not thinking about anything except whether the food was going to be adequate and whether the evening would end without incident. 10 minutes was a long time to retrieve a wrap from a chair by a window. I had not registered that until right now. I got up from the bed and walked to the window. The October air pressed cool against the glass. Down on Magnolia Lane, the streetlights were on, the neighborhood quiet and settled into Sunday night. A dog barked once somewhere down the block and then went quiet. I went to my writing desk and took out a legal pad and a pen. I wrote down what I knew, not what I suspected, not what I feared, only what I knew. The ring had been in the box when I left for dinner, because I had seen it that morning when I opened the box to find the card with Robert's mother's cobbler recipe, which I kept tucked beneath the ring for safekeeping. The box had been closed when I left. The box was open when I returned. Cassie had been in this room for approximately 10 minutes before dinner. I sat with those facts for a moment. Then I wrote beneath them, what does she want with it? That was the real question. Not whether she had taken it, the facts made that geometry simple enough, but why? A gold signet ring with a dead man's initials had no obvious market value. It was not the kind of piece that moved through auction houses or jewelry resale shops without drawing comment. Anyone who knew anything about estate jewelry would recognize it as a personal piece, not a commodity. Unless she didn't want it for the money, unless she wanted it for something else entirely, And that was when I remembered what Robert had said. It was not a conversation I had thought about in years. We had been sitting at the kitchen table, this same kitchen table, maybe 6 months before he died, and he had been looking at the ring the way he sometimes looked at it, with that private, considering expression that meant he was thinking about something he had not yet decided whether to share. He had taken the ring off and set it on the table between us. He had pointed to the inside of the band. "The number inside isn't decoration, Ellie," he had said. "Don't ever forget that." I had looked at the engraving, a sequence of digits I had always assumed was a jeweler's mark or a date, the kind of internal notation that craftsmen sometimes used. I had not asked him what it meant. I had been distracted that day, something about a client in Savannah, and Robert had put the ring back on and we had moved to other things, and I had not thought about that conversation again. Until now. Until sitting at my writing desk on a Sunday night with a legal pad in front of me and an empty velvet box on the shelf across the room. I wrote the number down from memory, all 8 digits of it, the sequence I had glanced at perhaps a dozen times over 40 years without ever stopping to ask what it opened. Because that was what Robert had been telling me, I understood now. Not that the number existed, that it opened something. I set the pen down. Outside, the dog barked again, twice this time, and then the street went silent. Robert had worn that ring every day for 40 years. He had told me the number inside was not decoration. He had left me a sealed letter in the safe that I had not yet opened, a letter that had been waiting 5 years for the right moment. I looked at what I had written on the legal pad. The facts, the question, the number. That ring was not just a memory. Robert had made sure of that. And now, it was gone. The safe was behind the winter coats. Robert had insisted on that placement when we bought the house, said a safe that announced itself was not much of a safe. He wanted it inconvenient enough that you had to mean it when you opened it. Push the coats aside, find the panel, enter the combination, pull the handle. 4 deliberate steps. He said anything worth protecting was worth a little inconvenience. I pushed the coats aside. The wool smell of them, cedar, and something faintly like the cologne Robert used to wear, rose up in the dark of the closet and settled around me the way certain memories do, not sharp, not painful, just present. I entered the combination. I pulled the handle. The envelope was exactly where I had placed it 5 years ago, in the right-hand corner of the top shelf, beneath the copy of our company incorporation papers, and beside the small lockbox where I keep the household documents. White letter-size envelope, sealed with the kind of care that suggested he had pressed the flap down more than once to make certain it held. My name on the front in Robert's block printing capital letters, deliberate and unhurried. The handwriting of a man who had never seen the point of cursive. Ellie. Just that. No explanation, no instruction beyond what he had already given me that I would know when the time was right. I took the envelope to the bedroom and sat in the armchair by the window, and the one I had moved from the corner after he died, because I found I could not sit in it for the first year, and then found I could not stop sitting in it after that. I turned on the reading lamp. Outside, Magnolia Lane was completely still, the kind of stillness that only comes after midnight when even the last few lights in the neighboring houses have gone out. I opened the envelope. 3 pages, folded in thirds, written on the same yellow legal paper he had always preferred. His handwriting was steady throughout. This was not a letter written in illness or haste. He had written it with time and intention, the way he did everything that mattered. The first page began without preamble, which was Robert's way. He wrote that Hargrove & Associates was structured the way it was for reasons he had thought through carefully over many years. The company held assets, contracts, and client relationships that had taken decades to build and could be dismantled quickly if the wrong hands gained access to the right paperwork. He had worked with Marge Tilson. His exact words were that Marge was the most capable person he had ever employed and the most trustworthy person he had encountered in 30 years of business to ensure that the structural protections were sound. If anything ever felt wrong, he wrote, call Marge first. Before lawyers, before accountants, before anyone else, call Marge. The second page covered the specific architecture of those protections, the LLC structure, the signatory requirements, the audit protocols he had put in place to make unauthorized access difficult and detectable. He wrote it the way he explained complicated things, plainly and without condescension, assuming I would understand and making sure I did. At the bottom of the second page, in handwriting slightly smaller than the rest, as though he had added it as an afterthought that was not really an afterthought at all, he wrote, If you are reading this, something has made you uncomfortable enough to finally open the envelope. Trust that instinct. You have always read rooms better than anyone I know. I sat with that for a moment before turning to the third page. It was shorter than the first two. He had written the heading in capital letters, the way he sometimes did when he wanted to make certain a thing was not overlooked. The ring. He explained it directly. The number engraved on the inside of the band was the combination to a second safe, this one located in the northeast corner of the storage room on the second floor of the Hargrove building, behind the flat file cabinet we had used for oversized documents since the early 2000s. He said he had never told me about this safe because he had hoped I would never need it. Inside it was a single document, the original signed contract between Hargrove and Associates and Whitmore Estate Collection, executed 25 years ago, containing a clause he had insisted on and that Whitmore's attorneys had ultimately agreed to, a perpetual right of first renewal. As long as Hargrove was under family ownership and in good standing, no competing auction house could be offered the Whitmore contract before Hargrove had been given the opportunity to renew on equal terms. He had never mentioned this clause to anyone except the attorneys who drafted it. He had kept the original in that safe because he understood, in the way that careful people understand things long before they become urgent, that a document like that was only valuable if it could be produced when it was needed. He had not wanted it in a place that was easy to find. He had not wanted it in a place that was impossible to find, either. He had put it inside his ring, in a manner of speaking, and worn it on his hand every day, because that was the kind of man he was. The letter ended the way Robert ended most things, without ceremony, but not without warmth. You were always the sharper one, Ellie. I just knew it first. I folded the pages back along their original creases and held them in my lap without moving for a long time. The reading lamp made a small, warm circle in the dark room. The house was completely quiet around me. Robert had been gone for 5 years. But sitting in that armchair with his handwriting in my hands and his voice so clear in every line of it, it felt like he had never left the room. I called Marge at 7 in the morning. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been awake for a while. Marge Tilson was not a woman who slept past 6 on a weekday, and she was not a woman who needed more than 2 words of context before she understood the shape of a situation. "I'll be at the office by 8, she said, before I had finished explaining why I was calling. "Come whenever you're ready." I had met Margaret Tilson 12 years ago, when Robert and I were looking for someone to manage the operational side of Hargrove and Associates, while we focused on client relationships and acquisitions. We had interviewed 11 candidates. Marge was the 7th. She had walked in wearing a gray blazer and sensible shoes, set a single folder on the table between us, and proceeded to identify 3 inefficiencies in our intake process within the first 10 minutes of conversation, not aggressively, not to impress us, but because she had done her research and felt it would be a waste of everyone's time not to address them directly. Robert had looked at me across the table with an expression I knew well. We had offered her the position before she left the building. I drove to Peachtree Street with the windows down, the October air cool, and carrying the particular smell of Atlanta in the fall exhaust and Bradford pear trees and the faint sweetness of something burning somewhere distant. The city was already moving, commuter traffic building along the corridor, the glass faces of the office buildings catching the early light and throwing it back in long, pale angles across the street. The Hargrove building was a 4-story brick structure we had purchased and renovated in 2007, back when this stretch of Peachtree was considered a modest investment. The lobby still had the original terrazzo floor, cream and black, that we had uncovered during the renovation beneath 2 layers of commercial carpeting. Robert had insisted we restore it rather than replace it. He said a floor with history was worth more than a floor that was simply new. Marge was at her desk when I arrived, coffee already made, 2 cups set out, a stack of folders arranged with the kind of precision that meant she had been here for more than an hour. She looked at me the way she sometimes looked at me directly, without commentary, and said, "Sit down." I sat. She opened the first folder. For the past 3 months, she told me, she had been tracking something she could not fully explain. Meridian Auction Group, our primary competitor in the Atlanta market, run by a man named Vincent Hale, had been making unusually precise moves. At 3 separate estate auctions, Meridian had entered with opening bids that undercut Hargrove by margins too specific to be coincidental. At a 4th auction, they had contacted 2 of our long-standing VIP clients directly. referencing those clients' purchasing histories in enough detail to suggest they had access to records that were not public. Marge had spent 6 weeks trying to find the source. She had audited access logs, reviewed email traffic, spoken carefully with staff. She had found nothing obvious. What she had found instead was a pattern. The leaked information was specific to certain client categories and certain price ranges, which suggested the source had selective access rather than full access. I asked her about the legal filings from the past 6 months. She looked at me with an expression that shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a very controlled person's expression shifts when something connects. She went to the third folder. 4 months ago, a letter of authorization had been filed with the company's records management system, a document granting a named third-party permission to access client relationship files for purposes of a legal review. The letter bore the signature of Eleanor Hargrove, managing partner. Marge set it on the desk between us and turned it to face me. I looked at the signature, my name, written in my hand, the particular slant of the capital E, the loop of the double R, the way I had always brought the E at the end back in a small, closed curve. It looked exactly like my signature. It was not my signature. I had been signing documents for Hargrove & Associates for 30 years. I knew the way my own hand moved across paper, the way I knew the sound of my own voice. And looking at that letter, I knew with the same quiet certainty I brought to appraising a piece of estate jewelry that something was off. Technically correct, practiced, careful but not mine. I told Marge I had never signed that document. She nodded once, slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected but had not been willing to assume. She said she had not filed a police report. She had not contacted outside counsel. She had been waiting, she said, because she had learned from 12 years of working with Robert and then with me that the most important thing you could do when something was wrong was to understand exactly what was wrong before you announced it to anyone. I looked at her across the desk. "Who else has seen this?" I asked. "No one," she said. "I pulled it myself from the archive system on Friday. It hasn't been touched since it was filed." Outside the window, Peachtree Street was fully awake now, the morning moving along below us with its ordinary indifference. A delivery truck idled at the corner. 2 women walked past with coffee cups, talking without looking up. I sat with the letter in front of me and I thought about the ring on a shelf and the safe in a closet and the 3 pages of Robert's handwriting that I had read in the dark of my bedroom less than 8 hours ago. Someone had been using my name, and they had been doing it for months. Marge had scheduled the appointment before I left the office the previous evening. That was Marge. She did not wait to be asked to do the next logical thing. She simply identified it and did it, which was one of the reasons Robert had said she was the most capable person he had ever employed, and one of the reasons I had come to rely on that quality so completely that I sometimes forgot it was exceptional. Patricia Odom's office was on Peachtree Road in a building that had once been a bank, the original vault door still visible through a glass panel in the lobby wall, one of those Atlanta architectural decisions that managed to be both peculiar and entirely fitting. Marge had worked with Patricia on 2 previous occasions involving disputed estate documents. She said Patricia was thorough, unhurried, and had never once overstated a conclusion. We were shown in at 9 o'clock. Patricia Odom was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut short and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who spend their professional lives looking at very small details very carefully. She shook our hands, indicated the chairs across from her work table, and got directly to business. Marge laid out the letter of authorization and the 3 authenticated signature samples she had pulled from our corporate files documents I had signed in the presence of witnesses over the past decade, their provenance unambiguous. Patricia arranged them under her work lamp without comment and reached for a magnifying loupe. She worked in silence for 11 minutes. I counted, not because I was anxious, but because silence of that kind has a texture to it, and I have always found it easier to move through textured silence if I give it a shape. When she set the loupe down, she did not look up immediately. She made 2 notations on the legal pad beside her work table. Then she removed her reading glasses and looked at us. She said the questioned signature on the letter of authorization had been produced by someone with clear access to multiple authentic samples and sufficient time to practice. The pressure distribution was consistent in the large movements, but broke down in the terminal strokes. the places where a person's hand makes decisions so habitual they become impossible to fully replicate from observation. Alone. The letter spacing in the middle syllable of the surname showed a hesitation pattern inconsistent with the fluid motion evident in all three authenticated samples. Her conclusion, she said, was unambiguous. The signature on the letter of authorization was not genuine. Under Georgia law, she said, the deliberate forgery of an authorizing signature on a business document of this nature constituted a criminal offense. She said it the way she said everything plainly, without drama, as a statement of fact rather than a revelation. I thanked her. Marge took careful notes. We scheduled a follow-up to receive Patricia's written report, which she said would be ready within 48 hours. We walked back to the car in the October morning, and I thought about 4 months ago. It had been a Tuesday afternoon in June, warm enough that the office building's air conditioning had been working harder than usual, the kind of afternoon where the light through the south-facing windows had that particular heavy quality that makes everything feel slightly slower than it is. Cassie had called that morning and asked if she could stop by. She had some insurance documents that needed a signature. She said, routine policy, renewal things, and since she was going to be in the area anyway, it would save everyone the trouble of mailing them. I had said of course. I had not thought twice about it. She arrived at 2:30 with a manila folder and a pleasant expression, and a pen she produced from her bag with the efficiency of someone who came prepared. She explained each document briefly as she set them in front of me: coverage confirmation, beneficiary designation, update, liability addendum, 2 or 3 others I could not now specifically name, because there had been nothing about the afternoon that suggested I should be paying the kind of attention I was now paying to it in retrospect. I had signed where she indicated 7 or 8 pages in total, spread across perhaps 20 minutes of conversation about Derek's renovation project in Midtown and whether I had seen the new restaurant that had opened on Ponce de Leon Avenue. She had gathered everything neatly back into the folder when we were done and thanked me and said she would take care of the filing herself. I had walked her to the elevator and gone back to a client call I had interrupted to meet her. Sitting in the car on Peachtree Road now, I understood exactly what had happened in those 20 minutes. Not all 7 or 8 pages had been insurance documents. One of them, or perhaps something she had slipped beneath or between the others, something I had signed without separating the pages fully, had been a different document entirely. She had needed a genuine signature to study and replicate. She had needed to see how I held a pen, how I moved across paper, the specific habits of a hand that had been signing the same name for 63 years. She had not needed to steal anything. She had not needed to break into anything. She had simply needed me to trust her, and she had known I would because she was my son's wife, and it was a Tuesday afternoon in June, and there was no reason in the world to think that a manila folder of insurance papers was anything other than exactly what she said it was. She didn't need my permission. She just needed my signature. And I had given it to her without knowing. The phone rang at 6 in the morning. I was already awake. I had been awake since 4:30, lying in the dark with the particular alertness that comes not from rest but from a mind that has been working through the night and simply forgotten to stop. I had been thinking about Patricia Odom's words, about the letter of authorization, about a Tuesday afternoon in June and a manila folder and 20 minutes of ordinary conversation that had not been ordinary at all. I picked up on the first ring. Marge said 2 words before anything else. Whitmore called. I sat up. Whitmore Estate Collection had been our partner for 25 years. Catherine Whitmore's grandmother had founded the collection in the 1960s textiles, decorative arts, regional American furniture, and when Catherine had inherited the management of it 15 years ago, she had continued the relationship with Hargrove that her grandmother had established because, as she once told Robert, she did not believe in changing arrangements that worked. The annual contract was worth $4.2 million and represented roughly a third of Hargrove's revenue. It was not our largest account in terms of volume, but it was our most stable one, and in this business, stability was its own form of currency. Marge told me what had happened quickly and without editorializing, which was her way. 3 days ago, Catherine Whitmore's office had received a communication she would not say from whom, only that it came through a legal intermediary containing what was described as internal documentation, raising concerns about Hargrove's financial management and operational integrity. The communication suggested that a change in partnership might be in the collection's best interest before the current contract expired. The current contract expired in 72 hours. Catherine had not called Marge immediately. She had spent 2 days consulting with her own attorneys and board members. She had called this morning, Marge said, because she felt she owed us the courtesy of a direct conversation before making any decisions. She had also, in the same conversation, confirmed that Meridian Auction Group had reached out to her office the previous week with a formal proposal. I asked Marge what was in the communication Whitmore had received. Marge was quiet for a moment. Then she said it contained client billing records, internal pricing strategy documents, and a summary of what was described as an ongoing investigation into Hargrove's compliance practices. All of it, she said, was either fabricated or taken entirely out of context, but it had been assembled with enough specificity to be persuasive to someone who did not know better. I thought about the pattern she had described 2 days ago: the targeted leaks, the precise undercutting at 3 separate auctions, the VIP client contacts. I thought about a manila folder and a pen produced from a bag with practiced efficiency. Someone had been building this for months, not impulsively, not carelessly, but with the kind of patience that required a plan and a timeline and a destination. The destination was 72 hours from now. I got out of bed and walked to the window. The street below was still quiet, the morning not yet fully assembled. The sky over Atlanta, the particular gray-blue that comes just before the light, decides what it is going to be. I asked Marge whether Catherine Whitmore had made a final decision. She said no. Catherine had said she would not sign anything until she had spoken with Ellie directly, but she needed that conversation to happen in person, and she needed it to happen before the contract window closed. I asked how long we had before Meridian's proposal required a response. Marge said Meridian had given Whitmore until Friday evening. 72 hours. I stood at the window for 30 seconds. I know it was 30 seconds because I counted them, the same way I had counted Patricia Odom's 11 minutes of silence, giving the time a shape so I could move through it cleanly. Outside, the first car of the morning turned onto Magnolia Lane and passed slowly beneath the oak trees, its headlights still on in the early gray. 30 seconds was enough. I told Marge to get me a meeting with Whitmore, in person, at their offices, as soon as Catherine's schedule would allow, today if possible, tomorrow morning at the latest. Then I told her one more thing. Don't tell anyone else, I said. Not staff, not anyone outside this office, just you and me until I say otherwise. Marge said she understood. She said she would call Catherine's office when it opened at 8 and would have an answer for me within the hour. She asked if there was anything else I needed right now. I looked at the legal pad on my desk, the one I had started 2 nights ago with a list of facts and a question. What does she want with it? The question had been answered. The facts had multiplied. What remained now was not investigation, but decision. No, I said, just the meeting. I set the phone down and stood in the quiet of my bedroom as the morning assembled itself slowly outside the window, the gray-blue shading towards something warmer, the oak trees on Magnolia Lane beginning to take their shape against the lightening sky. I had 72 hours, and for the first time since Robert died, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I was at my writing desk when the doorbell rang. It was 3 in the afternoon, the October light coming through the front windows at that low, late-day angle that turns everything amber and unhurried, and I had been sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, working through a set of notes I had made after Marge's call that morning. Marge had reached Catherine Whitmore's office at 8:15. Catherine had agreed to meet Thursday morning at 10. That gave me less than 20 hours to prepare everything I needed to say. I was not expecting anyone. I opened the front door and found Lily standing on the porch with her school backpack over one shoulder and an expression on her face that I recognized immediately, not distress, not fear, but the particular focused calm of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it. She had walked from school. I could tell from the slight color in her cheeks and the way she was breathing. It was 1.5 miles from her school to my house on Magnolia Lane. She had not texted first. I opened the door wider and stepped back, and she came in without saying anything, setting her backpack down on the bench in the entryway the way she always did, as though she had done it 1,000 times, which she had. I followed her to the kitchen. She sat down at the table and put her phone on the surface between us, face up. Then she looked at me with those steady dark eyes that had always reminded me of the way Robert looked at things he was about to explain carefully. 2 weeks ago, she said, I was doing homework in the kitchen at home. Step counter was out. Dad was at a client meeting. I was at the island, on the far side with my laptop open. I had my earbuds in, but the music was off. I do that sometimes when I don't want to be interrupted. She said it without apology or preamble, a girl delivering a factual account. Cassie came in through the back door. She didn't see me. She went to the far end of the kitchen and called someone. I could hear her clearly. She paused. I knew in the first 30 seconds it wasn't a normal call. I don't know exactly how I knew. I just did. She looked at me steadily. So I started recording. She unlocked the phone and opened a voice memo application. The file was labeled only with a date 2 Sundays before the dinner at Derek and Cassie's house. 23 minutes and 14 seconds. She pressed play and set the phone between us on the table. I listened. Cassie's voice came through the small speaker with the slightly compressed quality of a recording made on a phone left face down on a counter. She was speaking to a man, his voice deeper, confident in the particular way of someone accustomed to being agreed with. It took me perhaps 45 seconds to understand who he was. He mentioned Meridian twice in the first minute. He referred to a proposal and a timeline and a window that was closing. They discussed the Hargrove client list in specific terms, not categories, not approximations, but names and purchasing histories and relationship notes that existed only in our internal files. They discussed the pricing strategy Hargrove used for the Whitmore catalog, the reserve thresholds, and the ceiling margins that Robert and I had developed over 2 decades of working with that collection. They discussed a communication that had been prepared and was ready to send to Catherine Whitmore's office, a communication designed to create doubt about Hargrove's management practices, and they discussed the contract. The man said the window expired Friday evening. He said if the communication was effective and Whitmore declined to renew with Hargrove, Meridian's proposal was structured to move quickly. He said he needed confirmation that the authorization documentation was in place. Cassie said it was. He asked if there were any remaining complications. She said there was one thing she still needed to locate, something she had expected to find but had not yet, something she described only as documentation that could complicate the transition. She did not say what it was. The call ended at 23 minutes and 14 seconds. I reached over and stopped the recording. The kitchen was quiet around us. Through the window above the sink, the backyard was bright in the afternoon light, the oak tree dropping its leaves in the occasional small gusts that moved through the yard, unhurried and indifferent to everything happening inside this house. Lily was watching me. She had not moved since she pressed play. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, still and attentive, waiting the way she had always waited, without fidgeting, without filling the silence with reassurance-seeking, just present and patient and looking at me with an expression that contained both the gravity of what she had just shared and a 14-year-old's uncertainty about whether she had done the right thing. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. I did not say anything for a moment. There was nothing that needed to be said immediately, and she knew that, and I knew that she knew it, and that understanding between us was its own kind of language. Then I said quietly, "You did the right thing, sweetheart, coming here, bringing this." She exhaled just slightly, just enough to tell me she had been carrying the weight of it for 2 weeks. "I didn't know what to do with it," she said. "I didn't know who to tell. I thought about Dad, but I didn't know if he knew, and I didn't know if telling him would make it worse." "You came to the right place," I said. She nodded once, and I could see in that nod all 4 years of Saturday mornings, all the cobbler and the notebooks and the quiet hours in this kitchen, the particular trust that gets built between 2 people who have always been honest with each other without making a ceremony of it. She wasn't supposed to hear it, but she did, and she came straight to me. Thursday morning came in quietly. I had slept better than I expected, which was something Robert used to find remarkable about me, that the nights before difficult things were often my most restful ones. He said it was because I had already done the worrying during the days leading up and had nothing left to spend by the time I reached the pillow. I think he was right. By the time my head was down on Wednesday night, I had listened to 23 minutes of my daughter-in-law's voice, making arrangements to dismantle what Robert and I had spent 30 years building, and I had made my own arrangements in response, and there was a particular stillness that comes from having decided. I was on the back balcony by 7, watering the container garden I kept there through October rosemary, late sage, 2 pots of mums that had been Robert's idea originally and had become mine by habit. The morning was cool and clear, Atlanta settling into a proper fall day, The sky, the kind of flat blue that means the air has dried out and the light will be good all day. The oak trees in the yard below were turning, the edges of the leaves gone amber and rust, the whole yard quietly becoming something different from what it had been a month ago. My phone was on the small table by the balcony door. It rang at 7:22. Derek's name on the screen. I set down the watering can and picked it up. Mom. His voice had a particular quality I recognized not from anything he said, but from the cadence of that single word, the way a person sounds when they have been given a script and are trying to deliver it naturally. Derek was not a natural performer. He never had been. Robert used to say Derek wore his feelings on the outside, which he meant as a compliment, and I had always agreed with him. "Good morning," I said. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine, that the weather was good and the rosemary was still holding on, which was optimistic for October. He made a sound that was meant to be a laugh and didn't quite get there. Then he said he had been talking with Cassie. He said it carefully, the way people say things they have been coached to say carefully, not deceptively. Derek was not a deceptive person, but with the particular tentativeness of someone who has been handed information and has not yet had the time or the opportunity to fully evaluate it himself. Cassie had mentioned, he said, that she was concerned about the company, that there had been some questions about the financial management side of things, that she had been looking into it just as a precaution, just because she cared about the family, and that she thought it might be helpful if some of the administrative responsibilities were shared more formally. He paused. Then he said she had mentioned some paperwork. A power of attorney arrangement, he said, just to make things easier, just so there was someone who could step in and handle things if I ever needed support. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I had heard this story before, not from Derek, but I had heard its shape, the gentle framing of concern, the language of care and practicality wrapped around something that was neither caring nor practical. I had seen it in business, in estate disputes, in the quiet maneuvering that happens when someone believes they have correctly assessed a situation, and the person most affected by that assessment is not in the room. What I had never expected was to hear it from my son's mouth, in his careful, uncomfortable voice, on a Thursday morning while I was watering my rosemary. He was not doing this to hurt me. I understood that completely, and without reservation. Derek was a man who trusted the people closest to him, which was not a flaw. It was simply a quality that became dangerous when the person closest to him had spent months carefully constructing a version of reality designed to make his trust work against him. He was not my enemy. He was a man who had been told a very convincing story. I let a beat of silence pass not long enough to alarm him, just long enough to let him know I had heard him fully. "Derek," I said, and I kept my voice exactly the way I wanted it, warm, unhurried, the voice of a woman who has nothing to hide and nowhere to rush to. "Everything is fine. I appreciate you checking in. I really do." He said he just wanted to make sure I had support if I needed it. I told him I had everything I needed. I told him the company was sound and the accounts were in order and there was nothing to be concerned about. I told him I knew Cassie was trying to be helpful, and that was a kind thing. Every word of that was true, in the way that carefully chosen true words can create an impression that is not entirely accurate. He seemed relieved, in the way that people are relieved when they have delivered an uncomfortable message and been told it was not necessary. He asked if we could get together soon. I said I would love that. I suggested coffee, just the two of us, and I said I would be in touch about the timing. We said goodbye, and I set the phone back on the table. Below the balcony, the oak trees held their amber leaves in the still morning air. A cardinal landed on the fence post at the back of the yard, sat for a moment, and flew off again in the direction of the neighboring garden. I picked up the watering can and finished the rosemary. Derek was not my enemy. He never had been. He was my son, a good man who had been handed a convincing story by someone who understood exactly which version of events he would find most believable and most difficult to question. The question was not whether I loved him. That was not a question at all. The question was whether he would believe my version when he heard it, and whether I could show it to him in a way that left no room for doubt. I sent the text Thursday evening, after I got home from the Whitmore meeting. I kept it simple. Coffee tomorrow morning? Just the two of us. There's something I need to show you. I set the phone down and went to make dinner, and 20 minutes later Derek replied, "Of course. Name the place." I chose a coffee shop on Ponce de Leon Avenue that neither of us had been to before, not one of our usual spots, not somewhere associated with other conversations or other versions of this relationship. A neutral place, a clean table. I wanted nothing in the room that would remind either of us of anything except what we were there to do. He was already at a corner table when I arrived, hands around a coffee cup he had not yet drunk from, wearing the expression he had worn since he was a boy when something was sitting on him that he had not figured out how to put down. He stood when he saw me. We hugged, briefly, and I sat across from him and ordered coffee from the young woman who came to the table. And for a moment, we were just a mother and her son in a coffee shop on a Friday morning in October, which was both exactly what we were and not the whole truth of it. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. Then I told him I had something to show him and I wanted him to listen to all of it before he said anything. He nodded, and I could see in that nod that he had been expecting something, not this, specifically, but something. Derek had always been better at sensing weather than he was at reading maps. He knew a storm was coming before he knew its name. I took out my phone and opened the voice memo application and set the phone on the table between us. I pressed play. He listened. For 23 minutes and 14 seconds, Derek sat without moving in any way that mattered. His hands stayed around his coffee cup. His eyes stayed on the phone. Once, about 8 minutes in, when Cassie's voice said something specific about a client relationship he recognized, his jaw tightened slightly and then released. That was the only visible thing that happened in his face for the entire duration of the recording. When it ended, I reached over and stopped it. The coffee shop moved around us, the espresso machine, 2 women at a nearby table talking about something that had nothing to do with any of this, the sound of the street coming through the front windows, regular Friday morning sounds, the world going about its business. I gave Derek a moment, then I laid out the rest of it. I told him about the letter of authorization, the document bearing my signature that I had never signed, the one Marge had found in the corporate files, the one that had given an unnamed third-party access to our client records. I told him about the pattern of leaks to Meridian, the 3 auctions, the VIP client contacts. I told him about the Whitmore situation, the communication that had been sent to Catherine's office, the deadline, the meeting I had attended the previous morning to address it directly. I watched him take all of it in, piece by piece, the way a person absorbs information that is simultaneously new and, on some level, not entirely surprising the way facts feel when they explain something you had sensed but not been able to name. Then I put the last piece on the table. It was a single sheet of paper a copy Marge had made of a document that had come out of the set of files Derek himself had signed. A general authorization form, 3 pages of standard language about property management and legal representation. On the second page, in a block of text that was formatted to look like routine boilerplate, was a clause that was not routine at all, a provision granting signatory authority over Hargrove and Associates' operational decisions to the bearer of the attached power of attorney. Derek's signature was at the bottom of page 3. I told him what Cassie had told him it was. He picked up the paper. He read the second page. He set it back down. He was quiet for a long time after that. Not the uncomfortable silence of someone who does not know what to say, but the necessary silence of someone reorganizing everything they thought they understood about a period of their own life. Outside on Ponce de Leon, a delivery truck was double parked, and the driver was moving boxes through the propped-open door of the shop next door with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing 1,000 times. The ordinary world, doing its ordinary things. Derek looked up at me. "She told me it was the insurance renewal," he said. His voice was flat and quiet and completely certain. Not a question. "I know," I said. He looked back down at the paper for a moment, then set it on the table and pushed it slightly away from him, a small, deliberate motion that seemed to mean something he had not yet found words for. He picked up his coffee cup. He set it down without drinking. And the expression on his face, not anger, not grief exactly, but something older and quieter than either of those things, something that looked like a man deciding who he was going to be on the other side of a moment, was the expression of the boy I had raised and the man Robert had hoped he would become. My son set down his coffee cup. For the first time in years, he looked like the man his father raised. I spent Friday afternoon at my desk. There were things to prepare, documents to organize, notes to review, a follow-up message to send to Catherine Whitmore's office confirming the details we had discussed Thursday morning. The work was methodical and familiar, the kind of work that occupies the hands and leaves the mind free to do its own separate accounting. And what my mind kept returning to, beneath all of it, was Derek's face when he had set down his coffee cup. I did not hear from him Friday. I had not expected to. Derek was a man who processed things internally before he brought them out into the open, which was one of the ways he was like his father, and one of the ways that had made the past week harder to watch than it might otherwise have been. He had needed to sit with what I had shown him. He had needed to let it settle into the shape of what it actually was. I found out what he did with that settling on Saturday evening, when he knocked on my back door at 7:30. I was in the kitchen when I heard it 3 knocks, quiet and deliberate, the back door rather than the front, which told me something about the state he was in before I even crossed the room. Derek had not used the back door since he was a teenager, since the years when he would come home late and preferred the entrance that made less noise. Using it now meant he did not want to be seen arriving. It meant something about this visit felt private in a way that the front door could not accommodate. I opened the door. He was standing on the back step with his jacket on and his hands at his sides and an expression that I can only describe as the face of a person who has spent an entire day looking at something they cannot unsee. His hands were not entirely steady. I let him in without saying anything, and he sat at the kitchen table, and I put the kettle on, and after a moment, he started talking. He had gone home after our coffee on Friday morning and spent an hour doing nothing in particular, he said, moving through the house, making lunch he did not eat, sitting in his office looking at nothing. Then, at some point in the early afternoon, he had gone to Cassie's desk. Her laptop was not password protected. He had not known that until he opened it and found himself directly in her email without being asked for any credentials. He said that detail had stayed with him, the absence of a password, the openness of it, as though she had never imagined a reason to lock the door because she had never imagined the person she lived with would look. He had searched her email for Hargrove. The folder appeared immediately labeled with a project code that meant nothing on its face. 8 characters, the kind of notation that looks like filing and is designed to look like nothing else. Inside were 341 emails spanning 8 months, organized into threads with subject lines that he read to me from memory. Whitmore transition timeline, client transfer documentation, authorization progress, final structure. He read through as much as he could in the time he had before she was due home. He found the exchange with Vincent Hale detailed, operational, a correspondence between 2 people who considered the matter settled and were working out the logistics of settlement. He found the payments a wire confirmation for $47,000 from a Meridian subsidiary account to a personal account he had not known Cassie maintained. He found the photographs of internal Hargrove documents, taken on a phone camera, the edge of a desk visible in some of them, the corner of a coffee cup in one. And he found his own signature. Not once, 3 times, on 3 separate documents he had no memory of reviewing. 2 of them he could trace back to occasions Cassie had described as routine, a property insurance update, a form related to Derek's own architectural firm. The third he could not place at all. He said he had stared at his own name on that 3rd document for a long time, trying to locate the memory of signing it, and found nothing. He stopped talking for a moment. The kettle had boiled and I had made tea and set it in front of him, and he had not touched it. Outside the kitchen window, the backyard was dark. The oak tree, a shape against a slightly lighter sky, the neighborhood quiet in the particular way of Saturday evenings when most people are inside and the streets have given themselves over to stillness. He said he had taken photographs of everything he could access before he heard her car in the driveway. He had closed the laptop and gone to his own office and sat there until she came in and moved through the house in her usual way, stopping to tell him about a showing she had done in Buckhead, asking what he wanted for dinner. And he had answered her, and she had not been able to tell, he said, that anything had changed. He said that was the part that frightened him the most, not what he had found, but how easy it had been to sit across from her and give her no indication that the ground had shifted entirely beneath everything they had built together. He put his phone on the table. The photographs were organized in a folder, clear, legible, comprehensive. He looked at me across the kitchen table, my son, in the house where he had grown up, at the table where he had done his homework and eaten his breakfasts and learned, over years, to be the man he was. His hands were still not entirely steady. "Mom," he said, "I need you to tell me everything, all of it. I was up at 5:30. Not because I had set an alarm, I hadn't, but because there are mornings that do not require one, mornings when the body understands before the mind has fully assembled itself that today is the kind of day that deserves to be met rather than stumbled into. I had slept, which surprised me a little. A solid 5 hours, deep and without dreams, the sleep of someone who has finished deciding. I made coffee in the dark kitchen, the familiar sounds of it, the grinder, the pour, the particular silence that follows when the machine is doing its work, grounding the morning the way ordinary rituals ground extraordinary ones. Through the kitchen window, the backyard was still dark, the oak tree a shape against a sky that had not yet committed to being light. Derek had spent Sunday here. He had gone home Saturday night to collect some things, and he had come back Sunday morning and stayed. We had not talked constantly, that was not what the day required. He had sat at the desk in the study with his laptop, working through what he had found, organizing the photographs he had taken of Cassie's files into a coherent sequence. I had done my own work at the kitchen table, preparing the materials I needed for the evening. Lily had come by in the afternoon, done homework in the sewing room, eaten dinner with us, and gone home before dark. The three of us had moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of people who understood what tomorrow was, and had agreed without discussing it to treat Sunday as the last ordinary day before it. Marge knocked at 7 o'clock exactly. She came in with her briefcase, and the focused expression she wore when a situation had moved from concerning to operational, the expression that meant she had shifted from monitoring to managing. She accepted coffee, set her briefcase on the table, and opened it with the same precise motion I had watched her use for 12 years. She laid out what we had. Patricia Odom's written report, signed and dated, 11 pages of forensic analysis, concluding without ambiguity that the signature on the letter of authorization was not genuine. The folder Derek had reconstructed from the photographs, 341 emails, 8 months of correspondence, printed in the sections most relevant to the filing. The voice recording transferred to a secure drive, labeled and time-stamped. The wire confirmation showing $47,000 moving from a Meridian subsidiary to a private account. The 3 documents bearing Derek's signature, cross-referenced with the dates and occasions Cassie had provided as context. Marge looked at the table and said what I already knew. "This is sufficient," she said, "for a criminal filing, more than sufficient." I told her I wanted to speak with Cassie in person before anything was filed. Marge did not argue with this. She had worked with me long enough to understand that there was a difference between having the right to end something and choosing the right moment, and that I had always been particular about moments. I called Catherine Whitmore's office at 8:15. Her assistant put me through immediately, which told me Catherine had left instructions. I confirmed what I had told her Thursday, that I would be present at the Whitmore Autumn event that evening, in my capacity as managing partner of Hargrove and Associates, and that I intended to address the renewal directly, in person, before the evening concluded. Catherine said she was glad. She said she had been glad since Thursday, when I had walked into her conference room and she had understood, in the way that people who have been in business a long time understand things, exactly who she was dealing with. I thanked her and set the phone down. It rang again 11 minutes later. The name on the screen was Cassie. I looked at it for one full ring. Then I picked up. Her voice was warm and measured, the voice she used when she had decided how a conversation was going to go before it started. She said she thought it might be good for the two of us to sit down. She said there had been some misunderstandings, some things that had gotten more complicated than they needed to be, and that she felt, as family, they ought to be able to talk things through directly. I let her finish. Then I said, in the same unhurried tone I would use to discuss the weather or the state of the garden, "Of course, Cassie, come to the Whitmore event tonight. I'll make sure there's a place for you." A pause. Brief half a second, perhaps, but there. She said that sounded fine. She said she would see me there. I set the phone down on the table. Derek was looking at me from across the kitchen. Marge was looking at me. Neither of them said anything, which was the right response. Lily had come back that morning. Derek had called her, told her she did not have to come, but that she was welcome if she wanted to be there. She was sitting at the far end of the table with both hands around a mug of hot cocoa, her school backpack on the chair beside her, watching the morning the way she always watched things completely, without fidgeting, with the particular quality of presence that had always distinguished her. She said quietly, "Are you scared, Grandma?" I looked at her across the table, this 14-year-old girl who had carried a 23-minute recording for 2 weeks by herself, who had walked 1.5 miles to my front door, who had sat in this kitchen more times than either of us had counted, and learned in this room that silence and patience were not weaknesses but tools. No, sweetheart, I said. The quietest people in the room are usually the most prepared. She considered this for a moment, in the way she considered things seriously, without performance. Then she nodded once and went back to her cocoa. The morning continued. Marge reviewed the filing documents. Derek went over the email sequence one more time. I made a second pot of coffee and stood at the kitchen window for a few minutes, looking out at the backyard where the oak tree had given up nearly all its leaves now, the branches clean and particular against the October sky. By the time the lights came up at Whitmore Hall that evening, we were ready. Every single one of us. Whitmore Hall had been on Peachtree Battle Avenue for 40 years. Catherine Whitmore's grandmother had chosen the building for its proportions: high ceilings, tall windows, the kind of room that understood it was meant to hold beautiful things and arranged itself accordingly. The autumn auction was always held in the main gallery, a long room with cream walls and parquet floors and lighting designed to show estate pieces at their best, the kind of lighting that was warm enough to be flattering and precise enough to be honest. I had been in this room perhaps 60 times over 25 years. I had never walked into it the way I walked into it that evening. I arrived at 6:15, through the service entrance at the back of the building, the way Catherine had arranged it. Lily was with me. Marge had gone in through the main entrance an hour earlier, in her capacity as Hargrove's operational manager, to handle the logistical coordination that was her legitimate reason for being there. Derek had come separately, taking a seat near the back of the room where he could see everything without being immediately visible. The main gallery was filling when I arrived backstage. I could hear it through the wall, the particular sound of a well-attended event, the layered murmur of conversations, the movement of people finding their seats, the occasional clink of glasses from the reception table near the entrance. Catherine's staff had done what they always did, which was everything correctly and without needing to be told twice. Catherine herself came backstage at 6:30. She shook my hand with both of hers, which she had never done before, and looked at me for a moment without speaking, and then said simply, "I'm glad you're here, Eleanor." I told her I was glad to be here. She returned to her position in the front of the house, and I stood in the quiet of the backstage area with Lily beside me, and I listened to the room filling on the other side of the wall. At 6:45, through the narrow gap in the stage curtain, I found them. Third row, center. Vincent Hale on the aisle, a broad man in a charcoal suit who carried his confidence the way certain men carry weight, as though it had always been there, and he had never once considered that it might leave. Cassie beside him in a silk blouse the color of deep water, her posture composed, her expression arranged into the particular pleasantness she deployed in professional settings. She was holding a program. She had not opened it. She did not know what she was holding a program for. That had been the piece of it I had thought about most carefully. Cassie had accepted the invitation to a Whitmore event. She had assumed it was what it appeared to be a business gathering, perhaps an opportunity to observe, to assess, to gather whatever information might still be useful. She had no reason to expect anything other than what she had been told. She had been told very little. The program in her hands listed the evening's agenda. It listed the presenting auction house. It listed the managing partner who would be addressing the room before the bidding commenced. I wondered briefly whether she had read it yet. The MC's introduction began at 7 o'clock. He was a man named Gerald, who had worked Whitmore events for 15 years and had a voice built for large rooms, warm, unhurried, the voice of someone who understood that the space between words was as important as the words themselves. He welcomed the guests, acknowledged the significance of the autumn collection, and said that before the bidding opened, the managing partner of Hargrove & Associates had a few words she wanted to share on the occasion of the partnership's 25th anniversary. He said her name. He said my name. I walked out from the left side of the stage. The room was perhaps 120 people. I saw Derek at the back, upright in his chair. I saw Marge standing at the side wall near the third row, her briefcase at her feet. I saw Catherine Whitmore in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, and I saw the third row. Vincent Hale had gone still in the way that large, confident men go still when the ground shifts and they have not yet processed that it has shifted. His program was in his hand and he was not looking at it. Cassie was looking at me. Her face went through something in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, a sequence I recognized because I had seen versions of it in 30 years of negotiation. The rapid internal recalculation of a person who has just understood that the room they walked into is not the room they thought they were walking into. The composure held, but barely, and only because she was the kind of person who had practiced composure the way other people practiced scales. I reached the podium. I spoke for 4 minutes. I talked about what 25 years of partnership meant in practical terms, the collections we had brought to market, the estates we had helped families navigate, the work of preserving and transferring the accumulated history of a life. I talked about Robert, briefly, because he deserved to be in the room. I said that Hargrove and Associates had been built on the principle that a name meant something, that a signature meant something, and that the work of an auction house was ultimately the work of trust between the house and its clients, between a family and its history, between a promise made and a promise kept. Then I signed the renewal contract, on the podium, in front of 120 people, with Catherine Whitmore standing beside me. When I looked up, I looked at the third row. "This is my husband's company," I said, "and this is my granddaughter." Lily walked out from the side of the stage and stood beside me, 14 years old, composed and clear-eyed, in the good cardigan she had worn for Sunday dinners at this house, since she was old enough to have a good cardigan. They will always have a place in this room. The applause began somewhere in the middle of the audience and moved forward. Marge crossed the room while it was still going. She stopped at the third row. She placed 2 envelopes on the empty seat beside Vincent Hale, one addressed to him, one addressed to Cassie, set them down with the quiet precision of a woman who had been waiting a long time to set them down, and stepped back. Neither of them opened the envelopes immediately. Neither of them needed to. The weight of them was sufficient. I watched Cassie from the stage. She was sitting very still, the program no longer in her hands, her composure doing everything it could with what it had been given. Beside her, Vincent Hale said something low that I could not hear. She did not respond. For the first time since I had known her, Cassie had nothing to say. Just the truth, standing in the room where it had always belonged. 2 weeks have a way of changing the shape of things. Not the things themselves. Necessarily the facts remain what they are, the documents say what they say, the record does not revise itself for convenience. But 2 weeks can change the way a thing sits in a room, the way it occupies space, the weight it carries when you set it down and step back and look at what it actually is now that the immediate noise of it has settled. I drove to the Hargrove building on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after the Whitmore event. The same route I had driven for years down Magnolia Lane, left on Peachtree, the city moving past the windows in its ordinary way. Atlanta in late October had gone fully into fall. The tree lines along the corridor stripped down to their essential shapes, the light coming through at a lower angle that made everything look considered and clean. I had a travel mug of coffee in the cup holder and a list of the morning's items in my head, and no particular urgency in any of it, which was its own kind of luxury after the weeks I had just come through. Marge was already at her desk when I arrived. She looked up when I came in and said good morning and handed me a folder without preamble, which was her way of communicating that the morning had already produced something worth knowing about. I took the folder to my office, sat down, and read it with my coffee. The formal contract between Hargrove and Associates and Whitmore Estate Collection had been signed and filed 4 days after the auction. Catherine's attorneys had drafted the amended terms over the weekend, following the event new provisions that were specific where the previous version had been general, protective in ways the original had not anticipated needing to be. Signatory requirements clarified, access protocols defined, a clause that Catherine had proposed herself, which specified that any communication purporting to represent Hargrove's position required direct verification with the managing partner before action was taken. She had not needed to add that clause. She had added it anyway. I appreciated that about Catherine Whitmore. The second item in the folder concerned Cassie. Her firm, a mid-sized brokerage on the north side, had placed her on administrative leave the morning after the auction, when Marge had forwarded the relevant documentation to their compliance office as a professional courtesy. By the end of that week, she had been formally separated from her position. An internal review was underway, focused on whether any client relationships had been compromised during her tenure. I did not know the outcome of that review and did not need to. The Georgia State Attorney's Office had acknowledged receipt of the criminal filing 11 days ago. The acknowledgement came in a letter addressed to Marge, 3 sentences, formal and without detail, which was the appropriate response at this stage of the process. What it meant, in practical terms, was that the file was in the hands of people whose job it was to evaluate it, and that Cassie and Vincent Hale would, in the near future, receive communications of their own, that would require responses considerably more complicated than 3 sentences. I closed the folder and set it on the corner of my desk. Marge appeared in the doorway at 9:30. She said she had received a call that morning from a firm in Savannah, Aldridge Estate Services, a well-regarded house that had been operating in the coastal Georgia market for 18 years. They had heard about the Whitmore event. They had heard about it, specifically, from one of the guests who had been in the room that Monday evening and who had described what they witnessed with enough detail that Aldridge's managing director had decided to call directly. They were interested in discussing a formal partnership. Marge had scheduled a preliminary call for the following week. I told her that sounded right. At 11 o'clock, I had a meeting with Catherine Whitmore's representative, a woman named Louise, who handled the operational side of the collection with the same quiet competence that characterized everything. Catherine did. We went through the amended contract point by point, confirming the interpretation of each new provision, establishing the calendar for the spring collection review. As Louise was gathering her things to leave, she paused at the door and turned back. She said, "Mrs. Hargrove, I want you to know Catherine asked me to pass something along." She said when she received that communication about Hargrove, the one that was meant to make her doubt you, she almost acted on it. She said the only thing that stopped her was that she had known Robert. She said she decided that a man who built what he built would not have built it with someone who couldn't be trusted. She said Catherine wanted me to know that. I thanked Louise and walked her to the elevator and came back to my office and sat down. Outside the window, Peachtree Street was going about its afternoon. A city bus moved through the intersection below, unhurried. 2 pigeons walked the ledge of the building across the street with the air of people who had decided long ago that this was their corner and saw no reason to revisit the decision. Robert had known. Not the specifics. He could not have known the specifics. But the principle of it, the architecture of protection he had spent years quietly assembling, had held. The letter in the safe, the clause in the contract, the number in the ring, every piece of it had been put in place by a man who understood that trust was worth protecting before it was tested, not after. I thought about Cassie, somewhere across the city, waiting for a letter that had not yet arrived but would. She had spent months constructing something she believed was solid. She had used my name as a building material, had taken my signature as a tool, had assumed that a woman who drove a 10-year-old car and kept rosemary on her back balcony and made peach cobbler for Sunday dinners was a manageable variable in a plan that was otherwise sound. She had not been wrong about the cobbler. She had been wrong about everything else. She spent months trying to take my signature. In the end, that signature was the thing that ended everything she had built. The roses needed cutting back. I had been putting it off for 2 weeks, the way you put off tasks that require patience when patience has been fully occupied elsewhere, and on Saturday morning I finally went out to the side garden with my pruning shears and a pair of work gloves and addressed the situation. The October roses had gone leggy and overbroad, sending out long late-season canes that needed to come down before the first frost. And there was something satisfying about the work, the clean snip of the shears, the particular smell of cut rose stems, the way the bush looked more like itself with each pass. Robert had planted these roses the second year we lived in this house. I was thinking about that not with sadness, just with the ordinary companionship of memory that comes when you are doing a thing a person you loved once did when I heard the knock. 3 times, quiet and deliberate, the back door. I set down the shears and pulled off my work gloves and went inside. Derek was standing on the back step. He was wearing his weekend clothes jeans, a gray pullover, the kind of jacket he wore when he was not trying to look like anything in particular. He had not shaved. He had the look of a man who had slept adequately, but not well, which I recognized as different from not sleeping at all. It was the look of someone who had done his sleeping, but whose mind had not fully agreed to rest. He said, "Good morning." I told him to come in. He sat at the kitchen table, his chair, the one he had always taken since he was old enough to choose a chair, the one on the left side nearest the window that looked out onto the backyard. I put the kettle on and got the coffee out without asking, because there was no version of this morning that did not involve coffee, and while the water heated I stood at the counter and let him take whatever time he needed. He needed about 2 minutes. Then he put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, the way a person looks at their hands when they are trying to figure out what to do with them, and he started talking. He said he had filed the divorce papers on Thursday. He said he had been to see a lawyer the week before, not one Cassie knew, someone he had found on his own, a woman in Decatur who had an office above a bookstore and who had listened to the situation without expression and then asked him 3 questions that he said clarified things considerably. I did not ask what the questions were. I did not need to. He said he wanted to tell me something that he had not said the night he came to the back door with his hands shaking and his phone full of photographs. He said he had known not about the specific things, not about the documents or the money or the company, but he had known that something was wrong for longer than he had admitted to himself. He said there had been moments, over the past year, when something Cassie said or did had produced a feeling he could not name but also could not dismiss, and that each time he had made the decision to not follow that feeling to wherever it was pointing. He said he had been afraid of what he would find. He said that was not an excuse. He was not offering it as one. I watched my son say this. I watched him do the hard thing, not the external hard thing, not the filing of papers or the finding of a lawyer or the confrontation with evidence, but the internal one, the naming of the choice he had made, and the sitting with the knowledge of it. That was harder than all the rest of it. I knew that from my own experience, from the times in my own life when I had had to look directly at a decision I had made and call it by its right name. He said he was sorry for not asking me directly, that day on the phone when she had told him to call. He said he was sorry for the years during which he had accepted a version of me that was not accurate and had not questioned it, because questioning it would have required him to question everything else at the same time. He said he did not know if he had protected me the way a son should. The kettle had boiled. I poured 2 cups and carried them to the table and sat across from him, in the chair that had been mine for 30 years in this kitchen. I looked at my son. He was 38 years old, and he had his father's eyes and his father's hands, and sitting at this table on a Saturday morning with the October light coming through the kitchen window, he had something else of his father's, the quality Robert had called, once, the willingness to be wrong without collapsing. It was a hard thing to develop. Not everyone managed it. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup. Rebuilding takes longer than breaking, I said. Are you ready for that? He did not answer immediately. He looked at his own cup for a moment, and I let him look, because the question deserved more than a reflex. Then he said, yes. Just that. One word, quiet and certain. The way certain words are most convincing when they arrive without decoration. I nodded. I reached across the table and pushed his cup a few inches closer to him. Outside, the side garden was waiting for me to finish what I had started. The cut roses in the yard, the work gloves on the back step. The neighborhood was quiet in the Saturday morning way, a lawnmower somewhere distant, a car backing out of a driveway 2 houses down, the ordinary sounds of ordinary life continuing in its ordinary direction. I didn't tell him it would be easy. I told him it would be worth it, and for the first time in years, I believed he understood the difference. Spring comes to Atlanta in a particular way. Not gradually, not with the tentative half measures of more northerly places, but decisively. One week the trees are bare and the air still carries the memory of cold, and then sometime in the middle of March, as though an agreement has been reached that nobody bothered to announce, everything opens at once. The dogwoods go first, white and pink along every residential street and parking lot and office corridor, filling the city with a brief extravagance that lasts maybe 3 weeks before the heat begins to build and the blooms give way to ordinary green. I had always loved the dogwoods. Robert had loved them too, which was one of those small coincidences of preference that accumulate over 40 years of a shared life until they no longer feel like coincidences at all, but simply like the way things are. The window of my office on the 3rd floor of the Hargrove building looked out over a courtyard where 2 dogwood trees had been planted when the building was renovated, and on a Friday afternoon in April I was sitting at my desk with a cup of tea going cold beside me, watching the light move through the white blossoms in the courtyard below, when I heard Lily's voice in the hallway. She came in with a folder under her arm and a question about the Aldridge intake documents, something about the categorization protocol for pre-1950 textiles, a question precise enough that I knew she had already looked up everything she could find before asking me. That was how she asked questions. She arrived at them having done the preliminary work, which meant the conversation could begin at the interesting part rather than the beginning. We talked through the protocol for 20 minutes. She made notes in the small notebook she always carried, a habit that had not changed since she was 10 years old in my kitchen, learning to measure brown sugar by feel. When we were done, she thanked me, tucked the folder under her arm, and went back down the hall to Marge's office. where she spent her Friday afternoons learning the operational side of the business with the same steady attention she brought to everything. She was 15 now. She would be 16 in September. Marge said she was the best apprentice she had trained in 12 years, which from Marge was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The Aldridge partnership had been formalized in January, a 3-year agreement that brought Hargrove's reach into the coastal Georgia market in a way that complemented rather than complicated what we already did. The Charlotte partnership had come through in February, a smaller arrangement initially, but with the kind of structural flexibility that suggested it would grow. The Hargrove building's 3rd floor, which had been partly unoccupied since the early part of the previous decade, was now fully staffed. Derek came to dinner most Sundays. He was doing independent architectural work, now a practice of his own, small but intentional, the kind of work he had always wanted to do before other priorities had accumulated around that want and buried it under practicality. He arrived on Sunday evenings with whatever he had baked that week, which had become his contribution to the tradition in the way that the peach cobbler had been mine. He was not a natural baker. He was getting better. I told him so honestly, which he seemed to appreciate more than effusive praise. He was rebuilding, slowly, as I had told him it would take. He was doing it the right way. Sandra Cho, who had been my closest friend since we met at an estate sale in Buckhead 11 years ago, who had been the first person outside of Marge and George to know the full shape of what had happened last fall, came by the office most mornings, with coffee and her particular brand of commentary on whatever the city had produced. Overnight, she had taken to referring to herself as Hargrove's unofficial ambassador, a title no one had given her and that she wore with complete comfort. She was not wrong about the ambassador part. 3 of our new client inquiries in the past 6 months had come through people she had talked to at various social events, which was Sandra's way of contributing to things she cared about. I was thinking about all of this, not in any organized fashion, just in the ambient way that a life sometimes assembles itself in your mind when you give it a quiet moment when I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. The letter was there. I had not put it back in the safe after the night I first read it. I had kept it in the desk drawer instead, in the same white envelope with my name and Robert's block printing on the front, because I had found that I wanted it closer than the back of a closet. Not to read constantly, I did not take it out often, but to know it was there, the way you know certain things are there without needing to look at them every day. I took it out now and unfolded it along the creases that had become familiar over the past 6 months. I did not read all 3 pages. I went directly to the last paragraph of the 3rd page, the one I had come back to more than any other, the one I had read on a Sunday night in October in the dark of my bedroom, and had not fully understood until I was standing on a stage in Whitmore Hall, with my granddaughter beside me, and a contract signed under my name, and the truth finally occupying the room where it had always belonged. "You were always the sharper one, Ellie. I just knew it first." I sat with those words for a moment. Outside the window, the dogwoods held their blossoms in the April light, extravagant and unhurried and entirely indifferent to the passage of time, the way beautiful things sometimes are. Down in the courtyard, a sparrow landed on the low branch of the nearer tree, considered its position briefly, and flew off again in the direction of Peachtree Street. I folded the letter along its creases and put it back in the envelope. I set the envelope in the drawer and closed it. I picked up my tea, still warm enough, and looked out at the dogwoods and thought about Robert, and about Lily in the hallway with her notebook and her precise questions, and about Derek on Sunday evenings getting incrementally better at baking, and about the way a life that had been quietly built over 63 years had turned out, in the end, to be exactly what it was always going to be. Solid, protected, worth the work of it. Robert was right. And after 63 years of living quietly, I finally had proof. It turned out the sharpest thing I ever did was simply refuse to disappear.